Hello and welcome everyone. Thank you for joining this Global Investigative Journalism Network webinar on investigating climate change. My name is Sheila Coronel, and I'm a professor of journalism and the director of the Stabile Center for Investigative Journalism at the Columbia Graduate School of Journalism in New York. Today, we will be discussing the investigative agenda for climate change journalism. Thousands of journalists around the world are reporting on the climate crisis, and multiple reporting networks have been established to further this work. All kinds of climate change reporting are important and necessary, but today we are discussing investigative journalism. We will focus on accountability, and specifically the accountability of governments, corporations, and other actors whose behavior has an impact on climate and the environment. In Gothenburg last September, just before the Global Investigative Journalism Conference, GIJN gathered 80 climate change journalists and experts from 35 countries in a meeting to discuss and debate what ought to be the investigative agenda for climate change journalism. We discussed what should be the priorities of climate coverage and what obstacles lie in our ability to hold powerful institutions to account. A summary of those discussions has been published in a report. A link will be posted in the chat box, so feel free to download it. Today, we will share with you the highlights and insights from that rich and robust discussion. I'm delighted that we have here today 3 speakers who were there in that Gothenburg meeting and who will share with us their experiences and insights. And they all made valuable contributions that contributed to the discussions and the report. So I'm delighted to welcome and introduce today's speakers. We'll start with Matthew Green, who is Global Investigations Editor at Dismog, which is a news site that covers the global climate crisis, energy politics, and the struggles for environmental justice through an international lens. Matthew has previously worked in Reuters and the Financial Times and writes the newsletter called Resonant World, which explores connections between the climate crisis and collective trauma. Sunita Narain is the editor of the fortnightly magazine Down to Earth. She's a writer and environmentalist with more than 40 years' experience in the field. She's based in Delhi, where she is Director General of the Center for Science and Environment, a public interest research and advocacy organization that researches into, lobbies for, and communicates the urgency of development that is both sustainable and equitable. Finally, we have Amy Westervelt, who is an award-winning investigative journalist and executive producer of the independent podcast production company Critical Frequency, which specializes in reported narrative for podcasts. A 20-year veteran of investigative journalism, Westervelt's work is often cited as among the earliest examples of accountability reporting on climate. Before we start, a little bit of information about the Global Investigative Journalism Network. For those of you who are not familiar with it, GIJN is the largest global network of nonprofit investigative journalism organizations with 244 members in 90 countries. It works with journalists everywhere, in nonprofits, commercial organizations, and with freelancers. GIJN has an extensive range of resources and tip sheets to help journalists worldwide, which you can check on its site, gijn.org. I would also like to remind our audience that we have live interpretation from English to Arabic, French, and Spanish, and back. So if you would like to use these services, please click on the interpretation button at the bottom of the button at the bottom of the home screen and select the language you prefer. We also want to hear from you, so please send us written questions and messages in the Q&A box, and we'll get back to you as soon as we can. We will start asking questions from now until after we hear from our speakers. When the speakers are finished, GIJN's Eunice Au will join us on the screen to moderate the questions. Finally, please note we are recording this session for posting later on YouTube. So let's start. I'd like to start asking our three guests today for what they think ought to be the priorities in terms of climate coverage. What issues related to climate change are urgent and deserve scrutiny now? There are so many of us doing accountability journalism, and resources are strapped. Given the urgency of the climate crisis, what should be our priorities? Let's start with you, Matthew.
Thank you, Sheila, and thank you everyone for joining us today. It's such a pleasure to see so many people from all over the world who are committed to advancing this investigative agenda on climate at a time when clearly it's never been more necessary and urgent. So I take a lot of encouragement from that interest from all over the world today. At DSMOG, we have three main priorities that we're focusing on right now. The first I would put under the headline of full solutions to climate change. We've seen how the oil industry, which is obviously the primary cause of the climate crisis, has worked very hard in recent years to position itself as the gatekeeper to climate solutions. And we're seeing this in its embrace of technologies such as carbon capture and storage, liquefied natural gas, which although is comprised of methane, is presented as a cleaner energy alternative, and also hydrogen, which is also often presented as a climate solution that will allow the fossil fuel industry to continue its business model with only a few tweaks. So we have a team of reporters who are scrutinizing these full solutions with a particular focus on carbon capture projects that ostensibly are designed to capture carbon from industrial sites or energy facilities. But when you scratch the surface, are almost always used to greenwash plans to dramatically expand the industry. So that's one of our main headings. We're also very interested in the whole ecosystem of what we might term enablers, the advertising companies, the public relations agencies, the consultancies, accountants, financial firms who are working with the fossil fuel industry to continue business as usual. And thanks to the work of Amy in particular and others, increasingly this sector is facing calls for climate accountability. We're recognizing that these companies play a vital role in sustaining this system, and that also they tend to be more potentially susceptible to pressure or scrutiny from the outside. So that's a big basket of work. And I suppose thirdly, it's climate misinformation. We've got major elections coming up this year. Is it a third or half of the world's population is due to vote in some form? Obviously a critical climate election in the US, but also in the EU and elsewhere. And we're going to be seeing a flood of misinformation by particularly right-wing forces that want to turn climate into a culture war issue. And just finally, attention you to a story I'll put in the chat by my colleague Jeff Dembicki on Jordan Peterson, the controversial Canadian academic who's just launched an online university, which is packed full of climate science deniers. And I think we're going to see more and more stories that really look at the forces who are very carefully organizing, not just in the fossil fuel industry, but more broadly politically, to derail climate action that is gathering pace in many jurisdictions. So there's a lot more we could say, obviously, on that. But Sheila, I'll pause it there. Thank you.
Thank you, Matthew. I now want to ask Sunita what she thinks. Obviously, fossil fuel companies and their false, solutions to climate change, climate misinformation are big priorities. Are there different priorities in the Global South in terms of or what are the most urgent issues regarding climate?
Thank you, Sheila, and thank you, Matthew. Fascinating list of issues that you put out. To some extent, they're similar, Sheila, but to some extent, they are different. For us, the biggest priority is really reporting on the aftermath of the disasters that are happening in our world. They're in our face. Their extreme weather events are happening, and as they're happening in other parts of the world, but for us, there are two big issues to look at. One is the human face and the human impact of these disasters and how they are reducing the ability of people to cope. And that's really the question also of how, what is it doing in terms of the migration of people from their homes? What is it doing then to the larger story of insecurity in the world, the intolerance in the world that is growing because of people losing their ability to be able to live in their own homes? I mean, today data shows us that migration because of new displacement are even higher than migration because of war and conflict. And for us, the biggest story then is to understand what is the impact of these disasters on people. But more importantly, Sheila, what is the why these disasters are having the kind of devastating impacts that we are seeing. And that's also then linked to the complexity of being able to understand the maldevelopment which is happening in our world, which is exacerbating the disasters, which is why it becomes important to hold governments to account, because if we keep making the mistakes in the way we are doing development, we will only make the impact of climate change even worse. And that's a huge story, both in terms of national understanding the impacts, the reasons nationally, and of course, the impacts globally. The linked story to this is the finance story, because there is the whole question about reparation, the whole question about repair, disaster relief. And the question there becomes, so what is the money coming for, and how is the money coming? And the big question that we have at CSC Down to Earth is to look at not just the quantity of money, but the quality of money. Because today the question is the money coming as debt, adding to the debt burden of countries, making it even more difficult for them to repay the debt? And as it is combined with the impacts of frequent extreme weather events. So what is it doing to the countries of the South and the crippling load that they're under now because of increasing debt burden and increasing frequency of weather events? That's one part. The other part of the story is really very much like what Matthew said, holding governments to account for the inaction and the fact that we are just not scaling up the solutions that are meant to be scaled up. The only difference between the journalists sometimes the writing in the North and the writing that needs to come from the South is one of much more critical understanding of really what this fossil fuel story is about. In the South, we need to understand the fossil fuel futures for us, the dependence of our countries, and also hold much more scrutiny on the rest of the world, because I often find that there is a lot of sort of very simplistic, naive thinking that comes out of the media of the North. Sorry, Matthew, sorry, Amy, not the two of you, but many of your other colleagues. And this needs to be challenged, because it's often said, oh, South Africa is going in for oil and gas. And we forget the fact that United States today is the world's largest producer ever of oil and gas in the history of humankind. And, I keep hearing these very bland statements about, President Biden has stopped drilling, wonderful, we've saved the planet. And we forget the fact that US has already overexceeded its carbon budget and is already blowing up the world with the amount of oil and gas it is drilling. So I think that's a big challenge for journalists in the South, to be able to put that on account. And then, of course, to be able to drill down, Amy, your words, to drill down on really the hard facts of what's happening in our part of the world. Because we need to make sure we don't make the same mistakes. We need to make sure that we can move ahead much faster. And the big issue for me, and the story that we broke last year on the creative carbon accounting that is happening, very much like what Matthew said, but the creative carbon accounting that is happening and the false solutions that are being put out, and they're coming at the cost of poor people. To me, the biggest tragedy is poor people. And lastly for us, Sheila, the big question today is, in the new economy that we're building, the green economy we're building, is it going to follow the same practices of the old economy? Are we going to mine the lithium, the nickel in the same way? Are we going to build the industries in the same way? Are local communities actually going to benefit this time? Is localization going to be something that will benefit our part of the world? Or will it be the same business as usual, the same rapacious use of natural resources, only this time it's for a fancy e-vehicle? So those are some of the priorities.
Thank you, Sunita. That is a long list. Amy, would you like to react and add on to what Matthew and Sunita have said? Matthew is looking mostly at the companies and the causes of the climate crisis, and Sunita is more on the impacts and the global development model that makes those impacts even more egregious and difficult to resolve. You've spent a lot of time talking about reporting on the enablers of fossil fuel companies. Is there anything else that we're missing here in the list so far our first two speakers have given?
I would just say that my priority right now, and one I think a lot of people share, is actually like the combination of those two things that Sunita and Matt just talked about, which is, we've been approaching stories more from a cross-border perspective so that we can sort of follow what these global companies are doing and saying in their countries of origin, and then how they're actually behaving in the global South countries where they're focused right now. And in doing that, kind of trace, okay, how are particular legislative ideas flowing throughout the world? How is misinformation flowing from one place to another? And get this like understanding that Sunita was talking about of, how did we get here in the first place, and how do we avoid just repeating it over and over and over again? So I think, yeah, honestly, it sounds so obvious, but having a group of people all looking at the same problem from different parts of the world is enormously helpful in doing all of that stuff. So yeah, that's kind of our priority right now, is trying to take a really truly global look at these companies that are global, that are more powerful than any one government, and at these like sort of trends and forces that are shaping this issue from lots of different directions. Yeah.
Right, thank you. So let's drill down again, your phrase, Amy. Let's drill down into more specifics here. When we talk about holding companies and governments accountable, what do we really mean? How does that happen? What kind of reporting is able to hold powerful institutions accountable for the damage that they are doing or have done to the climate? I don't know who wants to start. Maybe we'll start with you, Amy, since
we'll go in reverse.
Yeah, we'll go in reverse this time. Yeah.
It's such a good question because, I don't know. I've been embroiled in the last few weeks on this story about the investor state dispute system, and it's kind of a downer because I feel like it's this looming sort of shadowy quasi-legal system that is just waiting there to erode accountability the minute that we get any of it. So I think that for me, accountability really looks like truly getting rid of a particular practice, which is a lot harder than, changing legislation, changing government, winning a court case, any of these kinds of things. I think, in a weird way, I guess it's eroding social license maybe for the fossil fuel industry, but it's not just the fossil fuel industry. Like I feel like it's, to Sunita's point earlier, it's extractive colonial capitalism all over the world. Just that. So I think that accountability really looks like removing a company or a person or a government's ability to behave badly in one place, but also making it less likely that behavior is going to be repeated in other places.
Well, you can talk a little bit about the work that you've done, which is basically naming and shaming the enablers of fossil fuel companies, right?
Yeah, I do think
how effective has that been? Yeah.
They do. To Matt's point earlier, I think they're a little more susceptible to that than, the fossil fuel companies. They've been at it for a long time. I don't think that you take on the CEO position at an oil major if you're, susceptible to being shamed for climate change. I just don't think you get that job, So I think that actually, the PR firms, universities as well, that's an area where I feel like, not just, oh, this oil company donated a building to that university and is, that's terrible, whatever, but really tracing like this research paid for by this company resulted in this policy. This is not just research, this is pre-lobbying. That kind of framing on it is much more likely to get a university to kind of go, oh, maybe we should rethink this, as opposed to like, you shouldn't take any money from fossil fuel companies, or you should, because you should care about climate and, those kinds of things. So I do think, the management consultancies is another one, the fossil fuel industry in particular, it surrounds itself with not just enablers, but like elite enablers. They don't go to all the universities. They go to the top 5%. They don't go to all the management consultancies. They go to McKinsey, Bain, Boston Consulting Group, so if you can lean on those entities and the reputational risk that it poses to them being, the right-hand man of the fossil fuel industry, I think that could actually move the needle quite a bit faster than leaning on governments directly or on fossil fuel companies directly.
Matthew, can you weigh in here? I mean, what is the theory of change as far as climate investigative journalism goes? Are we going for, incremental change, trying to change the behavior first of enablers, hoping that will somehow seep into the bigger players? I mean, how do we make change in a global system that has been really resistant to change, and an industry that has really been quite flexible in adapting to challenges to its power?
A simple question for me there, Sheila. Thank you.
Yes.
Well,
Yes, yeah. I gave you the easy one, Matthew.
well, it is a great question, and I welcome the chance to reflect, because it is easy sometimes to despair and feel that the efforts that we're making are not supporting the change on the pace that we need to see to make a difference. Absolutely. And I think all of us have at times shared pretty dark thoughts about where we stand and where we're going. But obviously, the privilege of having an opportunity to do this kind of journalism is a great medicine for that, I find. I do think that we have to be careful about assuming we know what's going on. In other words, systems, large and small, can reach tipping points that nobody saw coming. Think of the collapse of the Berlin Wall, for example, that most people were not expecting. The implosion of the Soviet Union is a great example. I know there's a lot of journalists in the Arab world on this call. I'm sure some of them anticipated the Arab Spring, but certainly most of the voices who were paid a lot of money to tell us what's going on didn't. So I always keep an open mind in that sense. But picking up on Amy's examples, one of the things we're really interested in at DSMOG is really, and I know Amy is as well, is getting inside these organizations, these companies that she mentioned, where I think there are a lot of people now the climate crisis is unignorable, accepting absolutely that the impacts are hitting the global south much harder. They're also hitting the global north now as well, in a way they weren't even, I think, 5-6 years ago. We feel it now in our bodies in a way that, and I say we as in the north, didn't feel before. And there are many people in these companies who are genuinely conflicted. And we've had a lot of coverage in the advertising space of Havas, which is a huge French multinational advertising company, which prides itself on its sustainability credentials. And of course, and its climate commitments. And of course, in September, they took a multi-million-dollar deal with Shell oil company. And this caused enormous wrangling internally, or tension internally. And I think by shining a light on those tensions and speaking to people inside these companies who are genuinely conflicted, we can kind of create, first of all, allow that conversation to happen, whereas in the past it didn't, and almost up the cost of staying in the system so that more people start to essentially defect. So that's one pathway. The other, of course, is litigation. And I recognize that's not the whole solution, but the fact that California is taking the oil industry to court over climate deception, and other US states and cities, based on evidence turned up by many journalists over the years and other researchers, that surely has to count for something. So it's hard to take a kind of global view and analyze the whole system, much as we may like, but we can see these glimmers, which I think we need to focus on and really find stories that can really support those breakthroughs to widen.
Thank you, Matthew. I'd like to pose a similar question to Sunita, which is, should journalists then be focusing on the impacts of climate crisis in order to dramatize the urgency? Do you see the kind of glimmers that Matthew is seeing in terms of resistance, even within those same companies that are enabling or furthering climate change?
Sheila, I'm actually very conflicted at this moment, I have to say, because I see a lot of headwinds against everything that we are talking about. And I think that makes it even more difficult. I mean, if you look at the kind of resistance that is now growing in rich countries against taking any strong action against climate change, and the growth of right-wing governments in countries it is something that should concern us tremendously. And I think as journalists, we need to be able to watch out, call out, and to write about this. And the point about impacts is, Sheila, that we need to be very careful that we don't get caught into a trap of oversimplification of the story, and to be called into question, which becomes also easy for the right-wing deniers. And today they're not deniers in the old-fashioned sense. They're not skeptics. They're not climate deniers. They are sort of, they wear masks of climate friendly action, but they kind of take us into different routes. And I think it's very important for us as journalists to be very careful. I mean, my biggest advice to my own colleagues and my colleagues in our region is be very, very careful that don't call everything as climate change, and don't overblow the impact of climate change, because as I said, there are two reasons. I mean, if there is floods in, say, a very vulnerable region like the Himalayas, or even in, in parts of Bangladesh, if there is very bad floods, part of the reason is the extreme weather events and cloudbursts and extreme rain. But a lot of the reason is also the underlying reasons of how we are managing vulnerable ecosystems, and that is exacerbating it. And it's important to be able to look at both and not to sort of oversimplify the story, because, I keep hearing words like climate refugees everywhere. But, what really makes a person a climate refugee? We've had migrants all our, there have been migration stories across, and it's long before we understood climate change was hitting. So I think the biggest task for journalists from our region is to be very, very clear that we are being very factual, very rigorous. We're reporting from ground up. I think our strength is that we can do ground level investigation. We can go down, talk to people, understand the facts, and then report up. And I think that gives the credibility to the story. And to me, that makes a change, Sheila. I mean, in my entire life as a journalist for now many decades, I have found a well-researched story which investigates the complexities and is not scared to speak truth to power makes a difference. And we need to keep that to our heart. That does make a difference.
Let me press on that a little bit. Many studies now look at, how audiences are reacting to climate news, and they're saying that there's a great deal of climate news avoidance. There's increasing news avoidance in general, but particularly when it comes to climate news, people are tuning out because it seems the problem is so formidable, unsolvable, that there's nothing they can do. What can investigative journalists do to get people engaged in climate news and to see the importance of being informed and engaged in these issues? Maybe Amy, I'll ask you that again. You're doing an innovative podcast. Can you talk a little bit more about whether new forms of storytelling are needed? Are there new audiences that are coming up that want different types of news delivery?
Yeah. I mean, I think that unfortunately, I don't know, there's a whole confluence of things happening, right? The media industry is bleeding money, losing jobs right and left. I think every week we're getting another announcement of like hundreds of people being laid off from newsrooms. The sort of right-wing disinformation apparatus has really successfully eroded the credibility of journalists and pushed people towards getting their news on social media or from, Facebook groups or whatever. And then, there are all of these other, the more positive vein of this is that there are all these other avenues through which you can reach people. So yeah, I do think actually that the way we approach it is like we do the reporting, And then we figure out like every possible package that can go into. So it's like podcasts, social videos, infographics, reports, online posts, all of that stuff, because you have to go find the people where they are. And in terms of the type of story and the framing, yeah, I think we need to kind of get creative about that as well sometimes. I totally agree with Sunita about the factual, it's really important to have all the receipts, we like to say, but like, also, I feel like, presenting those facts in a way that maybe breaks through some of people's ideological barriers or things they've been fed in other places is helpful. I always tell the same story about this, which is I did a story maybe 5 or 6 years ago on a group of crab fishermen that had sued the oil companies, and they it was a fishing industry group. The lawsuit was around climate liability. And the gist of it was that, the oil companies had delayed action on climate change and told everybody not to worry about it. And in that time had prepared their own businesses to deal with things like sea level rise. And that, the fishermen had not had this opportunity. And so this was an unfair disadvantage. And I went out on fishing boats like up and down the west coast of the US and Canada. And more than half the people I talked to who were named plaintiffs in that case told me they didn't believe in climate change. They didn't believe that humans were contributing to it. But here they were suing oil companies over climate change. It was like, how did this happen? And they said, well, we were shown documentation that these companies were getting patents for like a tanker that could navigate a melting Arctic, or an oil platform that had been re-engineered for sea level rise. So they said, for us, it doesn't matter why it's happening. They knew it was going to be bad and they prepared for it, and they didn't give us that opportunity. And that's just not fair. And it was like a real penny drop moment for me that the importance of primary documents just cannot be overstated. People, if you can show them like, this is the memo that Exxon sent, in 1979, it is very compelling to people to see that. And then also that, we don't need people to understand climate science to know what's going on. All we need is for people to understand there's a fundamental power imbalance here, and they're on the wrong end of it, so yeah, I think I always try to come back to that very basic framing and make things as accessible as possible.
Matthew, do you agree? Are people as susceptible to facts as they are to lies and disinformation?
Well, another simple question for me. I think they do say, though, that showing people facts doesn't actually change their mind, right? I think that's what the research shows, which could sound discouraging for those of us who try to confine ourselves to facts. But I think I'd agree with Amy. The power is in the storytelling that we can bring. These are the skills that we have. And again, thinking of almost 400 people now, or journalists on this call. I mean, think about even between this 400 people, the network we have is an incredible set of connections globally to stories which almost somebody, if it's happening in your doorstep, it's not like super exciting, but when viewed from another perspective, becomes really incredible. And I'll give a fun example of a story for DSMOG, which did really well and got huge views on social media. And we put on, well, it could have been TikTok, but it really went almost viral, one might say. And it was based on a social media influencer called Our Filipino Grandma, basically a Filipino grandmother who basically normally does cooking advice or kind of tells young Filipinos they need to eat properly, and is essentially everyone's grandma. And she has over 2 million followers around the world. And well, mainly in the Philippines, of course, but in the diaspora as well, of course. And it turns out that she was quietly taking money from Shell to promote their drive and rewards program. And she's not alone. We found, I think, over 70 influencers that we could discover who were somehow promoting oil companies while showing you the best way to walk your dog, or, you know, cooking tips, or whatever other things influencers are talking about. And something like that was like, no one's ever imagined that Shell would be paying a grandfluencer to greenwash its products. But there you are. So it's like any journalism, it's finding something that surprises the reader ultimately, that is what, or the viewer, that is what allows
Or the
us to
listener,
or the listener.
Matthew.
Yes,
Just
exactly. You can see that, see that I'm catching up. But yeah,
Yeah.
it's that element of surprise, and and that's up to us to, that's our craft, and we have to always open our minds and come together in these spaces to kind of be one brain and see things differently than we can ever do when we're working in isolation.
So let's think about that more, because, you know, we have like hundreds of journalists with us today, and think about how do we leverage this global network of journalists working on climate change? What sort of collaborations are possible? There are so many networks now working on various issues related to climate and the environment. Is there a need for us to work more in concert with each other, or are these various initiatives, each one doing their own thing? Is that meaningful, and does that suffice? I mean, Sunita, you've worked in the environment field for a very long time, and I'm sure you've seen this environmental reporting field evolve over time. What changes you see are happening in terms of collaboration and networking that are positive, and what are, you know, less productive or less, you know, less helpful in terms of raising awareness about climate?
So Sheila, I think the most important collaboration is to really build perspectives. And I think that's the one that I see missing often. I see, quite frankly, I see a lot of collaboration happening where journalists of the South do case studies for journalists in the North. And I really get bugged about that. I have to tell you, Sheila, I'm not a case study material, and I'm not going to be looking at sending you a bit of information that you do the analysis on, and you have the perspective and you have the larger story, and I give a little bit of the ground level input into it. It bugs me. I think that's not a collaboration, and we should not call it a collaboration. That is another form of colonialism. Put it in any other words that you want, and that I see a lot happening. We get approached a lot as well. And I always say, sorry, we have perspectives, we have politics, we have a point of view, we have a way of writing. We know how to tell the story. We are also craftsmen of words, and we write good English, Matthew, being trained well in the by the colonial masters. And so we can, you know, and the internet gives us a level playing field where we can put our point of view across just like anyone else can. So I think we need a new form of collaboration now, and we need the collaboration to be turned on its head. And to me, the biggest collaboration is for journalists across the world to understand each other and to get perspectives which are clearer, because I find that's where the biggest problems are today. I can do a class for you, Sheila, if you ever ask me, on deconstructing the language that I read either in the New York Times or in the Guardian or any other. And I can tell you just how biased and double standard it is on the issue of climate change. Okay. And today, when we in our part of the world are really learning the double standards that we are seeing in the world, you know, climate change is an area that we need cooperation. And that's an area where we need to bring a common language, a common understanding. So for me, collaboration starts not by asking us in the South to do case studies on climate refugees, but to really understand impacts and to do investigative stories which have impacts on the global North as much as they have on the global South.
Matthew Dismog does a lot of international reporting on climate change. Do you agree with Sunita's perspective that a lot of reporting from the North tends to be colonialist and treating the South mainly as case studies of larger points that journalists want to make? And what collaborations do you think will work in this? Do we really need a common language, or do we need more to work together really as equals rather than as, yeah.
Well, I think Sunita has raised a very important and quite difficult question, because in the North, and I'm speaking now certainly for Britain, but many other countries, and acknowledging Britain's unique history of colonialism, we have not really begun as a country to reckon with the legacy of our imperial era. And we certainly haven't begun to have conversations about how the climate crisis is rooted in those patterns of colonialism and extractivism, which Amy has mentioned, and indeed racism. Because I sometimes wonder, and I didn't think of this, but I remember someone posed this question some years ago. Imagine if the climate crisis was causing the opposite effects and ice was accelerating from Scandinavia into Northern Europe towards Paris and London, having devastating consequences for Northern Europe. We can imagine that the response may have been slightly different than the one that we have seen or not seen over the last 30 or even 50 years that we've known about this problem. But even as I say this, I feel quite activated in my whole system, because I know that colonialism lives in me and my ancestors. My great-grandfather looked after horses in Rawalpindi, my great-great-grandfather, right? So, it lives in me, and there's a much bigger conversation that we could open here. And it's not all an easy conversation. So I agree with you that, Dismog, we'd love to do more in the Global South. We do often run op-eds from journalists in the Global South or campaigners, but we don't yet have the kind of budget or footprint. But I used to work for big global media organizations, and they're the most colonial organizations you can imagine, because they were set up to make sure that commodities were flowing from Kenya and India and Ivory Coast. The headquarters is in London. The bureaus are there. There's usually a white person in charge of the office. They're trying to change that a bit, but yeah, it's the most colonial system of journalism you could imagine. It's absolutely transparently colonial. So yeah, we need to talk about this. And but as I say, there's a lot of charge in me even thinking about it and my relationship to it. So I appreciate, Sunita, you raising that in the way you did. Thank you.
Can I just add on
Yes.
to that something real quick?
Yes,
Sorry,
please.
I want to
Yeah.
emphasize that when you make the effort to do an investigation that's global, you get better stories. Like, it's good. It's not just like, oh, this is the right thing to do, we should do this. Yes, I agree, all of these things, we should do it. But like, you also find stuff out that you wouldn't find out otherwise. Like this just happened to us. We're doing a global series on the crackdown on environmental protest around the world. So we've got reporters in Mozambique, Uganda, Nigeria, Brazil, Mexico, the Philippines, like everywhere, India. And because we were all talking to each other and all looking at this from different directions, we were able to figure out how certain ideas were were flowing, and to really see the impact that this particular network of conservative think tanks was having in multiple parts of the world. We would not have seen that had we not had multiple people looking at it from different parts of the world. So it's
Yes,
also just
Sunita.
like a better way to work. Yeah.
But
Right.
Amy, that's not bad. I mean, that's not what I'm talking about.
No, I know. Yeah.
That's a story where you're bringing different perspectives and different realities, and you're also reporting on what's happening. But the point, and I think the most important point, is that you're learning from the different perspectives to enrich your story. And I think that's the important part. What I find is that case study, that case study. We've already decided that there are climate refugees in India. Go find those climate refugees, write about them.
Right.
Us, because we need to put a climate refugee into our story. And I think that's what I am talking about, Sheila, that's why it's important for us to build this network, which is of journalists who will work differently, who will talk to each other, who will do it differently. So please, I mean, I'm not against it. We do a lot of, we're always looking for this kind of information. So don't get me wrong.
Yeah, no.
So-
I totally understood that. I'm just saying, like, when you do it the right way, like what you're suggesting, you also get better results.
Absolutely. Good point.
I see a lot of questions coming in the Q&A portion here, but I'd like to ask one last question just to close off this discussion before we open it up to questions from the audience. And that is, I mean, we've all talked about working together, about the things that, the priorities for climate investigations. I'd like to just ask a how question. So there's a toolkit that journalists use to investigate or to report on anything. But what elements in those toolkit have you found to be the most effective in reporting on climate change, and reporting also that has an accountability angle to it? So let's talk about an accountability toolkit. Would this be field investigations? Would it be using public records requests? Is it statistical analysis? Is it looking at satellite images? What is it have you found the most useful and impactful in doing accountability reporting? I don't know who wants to start. Maybe Matthew, why don't you start, and then we'll have Amy and Sunita close off.
Thank you, Sheila. I think the answer obviously depends to a large extent on the local circumstances and the story you're working on. In our case, we have done a lot of work, like others, on documents that demonstrate the mismatch between what the oil industry knew about climate change and what it was telling the public. And we've worked on this particularly with Shell in a whole series of stories over several years. I worked on a story last year that looked at documents from the 1970s and 80s. And we've just published at DSMOG, my colleague Rebecca Mead has published a series of stories last week showing the oil industry funding, or it's already been established at some level. It's not entirely new, but casting new light on the oil industry's role in financing climate change or greenhouse effect studies in the 50s or mid-50s, 1950s. So that's one form of accountability journalism. And these documents are then picked up on by the lawyers and attorneys running these cases in the US and Europe. They're poring over them, looking for new legal arguments. And they're also cited by congressmen and senators who are calling on the Department of Justice to launch a federal investigation into what the oil industry knew and what it was saying. So that's quite a narrow DSMOG focus. And I know Amy does a lot of similar work, and other partners that we work with also do. But there's obviously, as you mentioned, Sheila, many other types of accountability journalism we can pursue.
Thank you. Amy?
I think for us, and maybe this is partly because of the podcast component too, I like to hear people's voices, definitely the primary documents are very helpful, but I think that the thing that I lean on the most, and it unfortunately takes the longest and requires the most effort as well, is developing whistleblower sources. I think they're so helpful. It's so helpful for people to hear straight from the horse's mouth that, yes, I, used to work for Shell and I was doing research on climate change in 1975 or whatever it is, right now we're focused on, these people in the enabling industries, and like we said before, they're a lot easier to find and to get talking than maybe someone who is like a higher up at Exxon for decades. But yeah, I think I find that to be the thing that helps shape the story the most. I guess it's not always the smoking gun, although of course those people often provide documents and whatnot as well, but it's the thing that helps kind of make it land with people the most.
Right. Yeah. Sunita?
Yeah. So for me, Sheila, all of this, and I'll give you an example. Last year, we worked on a very detailed investigation into the voluntary carbon market as it was operating in India. And the fact is that it's very non-transparent. Data availability is just not there. Companies are not prepared to speak. We didn't even know where the projects were happening on the ground. So the investigation basically followed the toolkit, which is there for investigative journalists, which I think really is powerful. First, you need to be able to deep dive on databases that exist. And we essentially looked at the gold standard as well as the Vera database. Not very well organized, but put in a lot of effort into, making the links, finding the projects, putting it into an Excel data sheet in which you basically started understanding the picture in terms of where are these projects, who are the project proponents, who are the companies. And then you go after, you choose which are the ones that you're going to look at. And the most important thing is to understand, is to contact the companies. And if you get a pushback from them, you push back again. And then as we got pushed back, you go out and you go into the field. And that's what makes journalism really powerful, that you go into the field and then you bring back the story from ground up. And you explain what's happening on the ground. And that database with that ground field level story gives you that particular edge. And then you add to it by doing two more things. One is to be able to do much more deep dive into, say, the methodologies here, or the understanding of how they were fudging the data. So the analytical portion of this, to be able to understand the data and the way that they were presenting it becomes very key. And then the last part of it for me is always the perspectives, because the analysis as just words is not good enough, the perspectives. And here, essentially, we could show our readers that the biogas projects that were being done as part of this voluntary carbon market was actually the poor people of our part of the world and poor government subsidizing someone who was buying a luxury bag in Gucci, or the Michelin company, which was taking offsets for us. So we were subsidizing, and that is important to bring out. So I think to me, those are the four parts of my toolkit, as I tell my colleagues.
So thank you, everyone. I'd like our audience now to ask questions from you. There's a lot of them, and they're very good questions.
So we shared, I'm going to share later in the chat as well, our full report to the investigative agenda on climate change. I encourage everyone to read it. It offers so many tips and advice on where to look for data and documents and how to get whistleblowers and all. But there's so many questions in the chat. I'll get to it right away. I think first, maybe I'll direct this to Matthew. What are the most fruitful ways that you've used to expose malfeasance? Is it Freedom of Information Act, whistleblowers or leakers, trade documents, talking to local communities and activists, or all of this and more? Like, what is the most fruitful ways you have found?
Well, yes.
Eunice, I think we've addressed that question a little bit, but I'll have Matthew give a quick
Yeah,
answer.
I could speak briefly to that. I mean, I think it's certainly all of the above. And one thing I would emphasize from those is freedom of information requests. Obviously, again, this varies according to which country you're in. But here in the UK, we have a lot of success with carefully phrased freedom of information requests, and reinforcing Amy's point. The documents are there in black and white. We can see what ministers or officials are saying, and nobody can argue with that. So they can be a very helpful, powerful form of hard evidence if we can get hold of them. So I'm a big fan of the right freedom of information request.
Yeah, this ties into another question, because some countries, they have data, they have documents. It's much easier to get a hand on this. But what happens in countries that are less politically stable and they're at conflict, at war? How do investigative journalists go about pursuing climate accountability there? Amy, would you like to take that question after Matthew? Matthew, sorry, go ahead.
Yes, well, it's obviously a lot harder. And I thought what Sunita was saying about the investigation her team was running into the carbon offsetting market was a really important point, because it is often in countries that have fragile institutions or vulnerable governance that these projects are taking place. And maybe there are ways to collaborate using satellite geospatial imagery or other kinds of data, and getting creative about teaming up with other reporters who have different kinds of resources that may actually shine a spotlight on some of these areas where it's much harder to report, find the kind of documents you describe. But maybe we can integrate some of these different reporting tools to shine a light on these areas as well.
Matthew, just to put the record straight here, it wasn't data that was difficult in India. It was data that should have been available from the international registries.
Yes.
Okay, where the carbon is being bought. So it's not about vulnerable it's not about countries where data, you can go to any Indian village and find out what's happening. We're not difficult to find out information. And it's the same in Africa. The problem is, and this is where the real power is, the power is in the hands of the people who are, I mean, you don't know what the carbon price is today, Matthew. You don't even know who's buying the carbon offset. You don't even know what the registry is selling it at. There is no data on Vera or Gold Standard. So I think we need to be very clear that it's not about us poor countries not having governance. It's about the rich polluters who are really mucking up our governance systems. Sorry, I just wanted to make this clear in this case.
Thank you, Sunita. Amy, do you have anything to add on that?
I was just, I'm gonna bang this drum again. Again, I feel like, yeah, just having people on the ground who can go to the specific place in question and talk to people, like that's how you figure it out. We have a story right now on something happening in Mozambique, and we've got someone who lives in the area in question, and he's able to like live fact check for us if something's happening or not, you know? Yeah. So yeah.
Very good.
And do you have any advice on using visuals as evidence to reveal harmful climate or environmental policy or practices? Any tips there?
In terms of like photography, satellite imagery, all of that stuff. Yeah, I think that's really powerful. Because again, you can you can use it in the story, but you can also make social graphics and put those everywhere too, where you're just showing the contrast of like what's being claimed and what's real on the ground. That kind of stuff helps. Someone was talking about news resistance. I think actually that kind of stuff helps to break through some of that as well. If you have a quick visual that just shows you, hey, they're saying this, they're doing this, here's the evidence. I think it can be very, very powerful.
There is this question: what are the possible areas of investigation on climate adaptation finance?
Good question. There's a lot.
Yes. Okay.
I mean, there's a lot. There's so much going on right now in the financial world, and it's mostly very obscured. You know, it's not transparent at all. The private equity folks are deeply involved in all kinds of shady financing things, and they don't have to disclose really anything anywhere that they operate. In terms of more kind of international finance, you know, I think figuring out where that money is flowing to in whatever country you're in, and then trying to trace it back is a worthwhile endeavor. Even with like the litigation stuff, this comes up all the time too, right? Because in a lot of these climate cases, the end goal is like some amount of money for damages, right? Well, who controls that money and where it goes to? Who decides what good climate adaptation is, and how is that decision getting made? How much is that being driven by a particular company that wants to sell a particular solution? All of that stuff. There are many, many avenues, I think, to be investigated in the climate adaptation space. Yeah, Sunita.
Yeah, if I may just add to that, Eunice, I mean, exactly what Amy said. I mean, just take, say, the big story that we all wrote about, read about, was Pakistan floods a few years ago. And it was big, it was globally covered. And then we also reported on the fact that there was this whole group of countries who met, and there was a pledge to give money to Pakistan for the damages. But what we did not report upon adequately was, how did the money come to Pakistan? Did it come as grant? Did it come as loans? And if you did, you would have found out 90% of the money that came to Pakistan for the flood damages came as loans. Now, we all know what a poor state Pakistan is as far as debt is concerned. So when you pay for relief and you pay that as a loan, what does it do to Pakistan? And then, of course, Amy, the other question in terms of who then tells you what's the solution? What are the conditionalities that come with that money? And whether those solutions really work for a country like Pakistan, who's deciding? I mean, that's another part of it. But I think just this thing that, you know, we all sort of dropped the ball on this, and we didn't really follow through. That what did Pakistan get? And did they get this as money, as grants, or as loans?
Thanks for sharing, Sunita. There was actually a question directed at you. You mentioned the green economy, and this person asked if you could expand on this. What area or topics or issues is important to dig into here?
Yeah, thanks. That's a very good question. I think the new economy is a very fascinating issue right now. I mean, it really, it's something that's fascinating me, and I'm writing a lot about it. My last editorial was really about the new trade systems that are now being developed, the war between China and the US for the control over the new green economy, the minerals, the technology that is going to come, and China having this huge head start. What will it mean to the manufacturing sector? Will it, in parts of Europe and in the US, the IRA, what does it actually mean? What does it mean in terms of the green transition? Does it delay the green transition because the cost transition, because green manufacturing will grow in countries like the US? And then, of course, there's the biggest issue, which is really about the question about extractive industries. I mean, we've all written about coal, we've all written about iron ore, and today the biggest issue that is going to come up is the mining for the new minerals, the critical minerals that are needed for the new economy, for the new green economy. And interestingly, and I think that's the most interesting issue that is important for us as journalists, is that the bulk of those minerals are found in the lands of the poorest. And it's not just the poorest in our part of the world, it's the poorest even in the United States. I was just seeing this fascinating data, Amy, of the amount of the lithium and the nickel and the minerals that are found in the lands of the indigenous, or what you call the American Indians in the US. Yeah. And the question of now what is going to happen, what are going to be their rights over it? What is the prior informed consent that they will have? Do they have the right to decide whether that mineral will be mined or not? Will they have control over that? And that's the big Indonesia story of nickel. And now, of course, Zimbabwe has also said they will not export their rare minerals. So there's this huge amount, Eunice, that is happening in this field of the new economy as we're building it. And the biggest question is, who's going to control it? What's going to be the market, the framing of it? Is it going to be the same companies which built all the fossil fuel systems that we so despise today that are going to build these new economy? And are they going to have better principles, better judgment, or are we in further trouble?
Wow, okay, we're gonna need a whole series of sessions on this. I think we touched a little bit on disinformation and climate deniers just now, but this question is regarding disinformation and climate change. What is working now and what isn't working now to address it? What tools do journalists have to combat this? Matthew, would you like to take this question?
Oh, thanks. Yeah, I mean, I could say briefly, it's obviously very difficult because maybe the way news has become siloed means that we're increasingly exposed to sources that reinforce our existing preconceptions. So all we can do at somewhere like DSMOG is try to illuminate where this misinformation is coming from, the kinds of networks, individuals, institutions, think tanks that are pushing this agenda. But it's very difficult to counteract it once it's out in the information ecosystem. Amy may have more sophisticated things, or Sunita, to say than me on that.
Sunita?
Amy, please.
I don't know. It's hard. I think rapid response is basically the thing that works the most, you know. And actually, something I think that we don't do enough as journalists, and partly this is just because of how the media news cycles work, is pre-bunking. You know, there's a lot, like we know what they're gonna say. They've been saying the same thing for 100 years with slightly different flavors, you know. But we wait until something like some dumb BP ad drops and then we react to it. So I think actually trying to get out in front of these things a little bit more would be quite helpful. And then when the ad drops, you can be like, remember, we told you this was going to happen, and here it is. Here's a great example, and this is all the reasons that it's not right. And again, I just feel like that to the extent that it's possible, and I know everyone is strapped for time and resources and all that, but the more places you can put that stuff, the better. You know, like a newsletter, online, social, podcast, all of it. Like we need to be addressing it in all the places. I think we're kind of like letting YouTube become this cesspool of climate disinfo right now. And I would really dearly love to avoid YouTube, but I don't think we can.
Sunita, do you have anything to add, or I shall move on?
I think they've covered it very well.
Okay, so it's clear from the discussion, the report, that we need to rethink how investigative journalists collaborate and share information and strategize together so that we can scrutinize this climate industry better. But do you have any suggestions of what kind of new investigative approaches could work to bring about wider social and economic change? Sunita?
Quite honestly, Eunice, I don't think there are any new ways of doing good journalism. Good journalism is good journalism. Good investigative journalism is good investigative journalism. I think the question that we have to ask ourselves is, what are the stories? How do we tell the story? And in particular, how do we make sure that the complexity is not lost? Because I think the biggest problem that we as journalists have today is that it's easy to be caught in just sort of simplifying the thing, which is the headlines of the. It's very easy, and I think what we need to make sure as journalists is that we don't dumb down the news. To me, that's very important, because at the end of the day, it's not about just getting people to change that light bulb today. It's really about making sure that that energy system of the future gets built and built right. And I think that's the sustaining power that we need. And for that, each one of our words becomes very important.
Sorry, Sheila, I took a lot of time, but this is probably the final question. Or final two questions. So there are so many aspects to investigating climate change that you've all covered here and in the report. Is the best strategy to focus on one company at a time so that you don't get overwhelmed?
Oh, I don't know. I think for me in general, I feel like proclaiming anything to be the best strategy is sort of a fool's errand. We have to cover all the stories all the time. And I love what Sunita just said about not being, shying away from the complexity. I feel like there's this real tendency to sort of chuck complexity and nuance and, detailed storytelling and reporting in favor. And, I just said like just do a quick picture. Yes, do that. But also I think having the really thorough story is really important too. There are, not just for readers, because I think some readers will read all of that, but also just kind of for the public record and for legislators, all that stuff. There's for even, people within the climate movement, they're often our audience as well, and like they're not getting everything right. you know, so yeah. I don't know, focusing on one company at a time is like the trick. For some people, yeah, for a particular angle, yes, it very well might be. But I think it just depends on the story and what you're trying to do and how much space and time you have too.
Thank you for answering that. So one of the places to look for red flags are the annual reports and other regulatory filings. But as we've noted, the companies are masters of greenwashing. So how can journalists see through this greenwashing, and like which experts should journalists have on speed dial to be able to understand all these technical records and stuff?
I have one really quick thing for that, and that is like read the trade magazines and how they speak to people in those publications, and join earnings calls, or listen to them. They're often recorded and posted on a bunch of websites after the fact. The way they speak to their shareholders and to the industry is what they're actually doing, and they don't actually hide it. No, it's not that hard to find that stuff.
Matthew, you were nodding your head. Do you want to add anything?
Just to echo all that Amy said. Also, one technique we often use at DSMOG is to, if we can, attend industry conferences where, under the same principle that if you're in the room when the industry is talking to the industry, you're much likely to hear the unvarnished truth. I think one of my favorites examples was, I think that a few years ago, an ExxonMobil executive comparing carbon capture to Diet Coke and saying, like, supposed to make you slim, Diet Coke. So it's like Diet Coke. Everybody wants it to work, but everyone knows that it doesn't. It's just that's the story, isn't it? That's it, isn't it? Once you've got that quote from an Exxon
Wow.
executive, you've won. That's the end of it, right? So that you can really get the hot mic kind of moment. It's not really hot mic. It's actually what they think. So yeah, it's so that's, if it's possible, then definitely worth a try.
Thank you for that. Sorry, Sheila, back to you.
Yes. So thank you, everyone. Unfortunately, we've run out of time, but before we close, I'd like to thank the Global Investigative Journalism Network and our audience today. Thank you for your questions and for your engagement with this discussion. And of course, a very big thank you to our speakers, Matthew, Amy, and Sunita, for very thoughtful and insightful answers to the questions, and for being with us here today and sharing with us your work and inspiring us with all the good work that you do. Again, the report, the Investigative Agenda for Climate Change, will be available on the GIJN website, and it should be somewhere in the chat box. Thank you, everyone, and looking
you.
forward to more discussions on climate.
Thank you.
Bye. Goodbye.
Thank you. Bye.
Goodbye.